Hi, my name is Al Benzing. I'm with the Commemorative Air Force B-29, B-24 Squadron, and I would like to introduce two videos. The first being part one that runs about 15 minutes, and it accompanies this great book called Reign of Fire by Colonel Charles Phillips. We are using this particular book as a special edition. That's B-29 Superfortress FIFI 75th birthday edition as part of our fundraising effort. Certainly in this time when we've had to cancel our tour, your support is certainly appreciated. So a little bit about this first video. It runs about 15 minutes in length, and it is set up around Colonel Phillips describing some of the events from his 31 missions. He also had a ditching on August 6, 1945, the same day that Hiroshima was bombed. And part of this is done in what was called brute force, a segment hosted by George C. Scott. The video quality is a bit dated, but the information is certainly interesting, and we have the advantage of us hearing firsthand from the aircraft commander. So we hope you enjoy it. I'll be back in 15 minutes to talk about the second part, which is a very well done narration of the 50th anniversary of the B-29, which was done in 1992. And it also includes our B-29 FIFI. Thank you for your support. We hope you enjoy the video.
Hello, my name is Charles Phillips. I was a B-29 combat pilot flying with the 73rd Bomb Wing from the island of Saipan back in 1945. I want to show you a few bits and pieces, excerpts if you will, from two films. One video is from the show Brute Force, which was hosted by George C. Scott. And you will see some conversation there about the role of the B-29 and some of the problems that we had. The second film that I'd like to show you this evening is Wings of Victory, which is made up in Seattle on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the first flight of the B-29, which was made in September of 1942. That will be followed by a video, which I have a copy here, called Superfort, the Boeing B-29. I hope this will be edifying to you. Let's roll the film.
Before the First World War, nations could rely on geographical distance to protect themselves. Their populations, industrial centers, and reserve forces seemed secure, nestled far behind the combat erupting over the distant horizon. But the bomber holds no regard for that geographical shield. It creates total war, a war where destruction can come to any place at any time. The bomber cripples a nation's ability to supply its army and crushes its will to fight. 1943 saw the arrival of the first bomber designed for hemisphere defense, the B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of its day.
The gunnery system was very modern. Previously, the gunners had had to operate within the gun turrets and handle the guns themselves. With the B-29, they were remotely controlled. And the aircraft was pressurized. It had a pressurized crew compartment up in the nose, and then behind the aft bomb bay was another crew compartment where the gunners operated, and finally the tail was also in the pressurized portion of the airplane.
When the Americans finally captured the Marianas Islands in the South Pacific, they had a launching point for sustained bombing raids against Japan.
They prepared on each of these airfields, there were 5 of them, 8,500-foot runways, which are pretty modest by today's thinking, but that's what we had, and we used most all of that footage on these heavyweight takeoffs. The B-29 would weigh 70 tons, 140,000 pounds, and you always hoped that every one of the engines would perform well, because the takeoff was the most critical part of the entire mission.
The missions to Japan and back were 2,600 miles, more than twice that of any in the European theater. With nothing but ocean beneath them, a slight navigational error in any direction meant they would run out of gas. Crippled bombers had nowhere to go but home. Some barely made it back. The B-29s needed an island between them and Japan, and Iwo Jima became a top priority for U.S. Marines.
Iwo Jima is probably one of the most critical pieces of territory that you could have thought of if you were flying missions like we were in the spring of 1945. To us, it meant a sanctuary for a B-29 in trouble, either due to fuel or mechanical trouble. He could go there and land.
The superfortresses were proving to be reliable, but their bombing accuracy left much to be desired. Dropping their bombs from 30,000 feet protected the 11-man crews from ground fire, but allowed the bombs a free fall of 6 miles. Unpredictable winds often undid the best intentions of pilots and bombardiers. After taking over the 21st Bomber Command, General Curtis Lemay reassessed the B-29's bombing record and took the biggest gamble of his career. His order? Remove the gunners and ammunition to make room for more bombs, fly at night, and fly low level.
I can remember that briefing because we all sat in a big Quonset hut, and when we heard the bombing altitudes, at first there was a silence throughout the hall, and then a great gasp from all of the crew members as they realized what they had just heard.
Given most of Japan's buildings were made of wood, Lemay was counting on a new weapon, the incendiary bomb. Even if they didn't hit their targets, Lemay bet their fires would.
On that first mission, there were 300 B-29s, which took off from Guam and Tinian and Saipan. Here we would be flying with no lights showing, in the dark, with just individual aircraft, no formation. We're all going toward the same place at the same time. We saw pieces of houses like windows and doors actually going by the airplane at around 8,000 feet. I've never been in worse turbulence in an aircraft anywhere that was stronger than that night, March 10th, over Tokyo. I thought the wings were surely going to be just ripped off the aircraft. The bonfire that was going on down there on the surface was throwing heat upward, but the turbulence was from that heat rising. Then you could not help but sympathize with the people on the ground. There were thoughts about the folks on the ground and what they had to be suffering. In our first firebombing of Tokyo, it was so bad that many Japanese themselves properly figured that it was the beginning of the end for them.
As the 20th Bomber Command in India and China were running operations in mid-1944, the Mariana Islands were being prepared for the eventual bases for the 21st Bomber Command under General Hansel. The Mariana Island Group was made up of numerous small islands, some too small to even consider launching a small aircraft from, much less a B-29 Superfortress. However, 3 of the islands were much larger and were now Japanese strongholds. They were Saipan, Tinian, and Guam.
The 7th Fighter Command moved in with like hundreds of B-51 Mustangs to the island of Iwo Jima. We're greatly indebted to the U.S. Marine Corps for the sacrifice of some 6,000 of their men to secure the island. And they moved in there with Mustangs, the P-51 North American Mustang, and provided us with escorts starting on the 7th of April in 1945. That's the best looking sight I've ever seen. It looked like maybe it was a movie of some kind that was going on. Japanese aircraft were coming up and the Mustangs were hitting them. They were going down in flames. There were Japanese pilots taking to their parachutes. It was wild. And we were driving down the bomb run quite secure in the knowledge that these Mustangs were driving off one of our worst enemies. So we were not encountering any enemy fire. It was being taken care of by the Mustang escorts.
Air crews came to rely on Iwo, knowing that they could find help for the wounded, men and machines alike. The high price paid to capture the island, the lives of 7,000 American fighting men, brought a return with compound interest. More than 24,000 B-29 crewmen who might have been lost in the Pacific found a safe haven. Bombs away came as an immense relief to the crew. Immediately, the captain would push the throttles forward and begin defensive maneuvering until they were clear of the enemy's ground defenses. They would now wait to see if the enemy would meet them in the air.
Japanese were very aggressive. They learned that a head-on attack was by far the best, and they would aim for the leader. They'd try to knock the leader out, which is logical, or the deputy lead. And they would come in at an angle, and the rate of closure was tremendous. I mean, they weren't there very long. I had a fighter aircraft go by me so close one day that if I could have read Japanese, I could have told you the pilot's name on the side of the airplane. I saw the rivets on the airplane as he went by our machine in the opposite direction, in the descending path. That's the closest I ever came to meeting up with any kind of airplane, much less an unfriendly one.
By the end of February 1945, General Lemay had come to the conclusion that high-altitude precision bombing against Japan would not accomplish the desired results if we were going to defeat the Japanese by air prior to the scheduled Allied invasion of their homeland. The weather was terrible over Japan and her home islands, which greatly affected precision bombing. Air currents were fierce and would throw the bombs as well as the planes off target. Lemay knew that he had to make some major changes in strategy. Lemay decided that low-level bombing raids using incendiaries was the approach to take for the following reasons. Reconnaissance photos showed that there wasn't any low-level flak. The B-29s had been flying in at 25,000 feet. Less fuel and more bomb load would be possible by going in low, especially at night. Going in at 5,000 to 8,000 feet would ensure that the bombs would hit the target. The radar operators would have better odds of finding the target. And instead of waiting for the weather to clear, the B-29s could go in under the weather. The downside was the loss rate. But it was calculated that less missions would need to be flown to get twice the accuracy. Estimates as to the number of aircraft needed to be effective exceeded the number of B-29s available to the 21st Bomber Command. But it was decided to go with what was available, and the first incendiary raid was scheduled for the night of March 9th and 10th, with Tokyo as the target, and would comprise a force of 300 B-29s. The air crews were apprehensive about the low-level attack, and many considered it impossible, more like a suicide mission than a bombing mission.
This is, of course, very distressing to the crews because we all just knew we were going to be dead men because the Japanese fighters worked so much better at low altitude, and anti-aircraft would be more accurate there, and there were just a lot of things that looked like this is just going to get us all killed.
New and untried tactics and methods added to their doubtfulness about the mission. At 6:15 p.m. on March 9th, the first B-29s of the 73rd Bomb Wing began their takeoff from Saipan. They were joined by the 313th Bomb Wing from Tinian and the 314th Bomb Wing from Guam. An hour later, there were 325 B-29 Superforts in the air, headed for downtown Tokyo. The most experienced radar operators in the 21st Bomber Command were aboard the lead aircraft as pathfinders. At 1:20 a.m., 7 hours later, they were over Tokyo.
It was our first mission as a crew, and the target was Tokyo, and it was fire bombs. We went in over Tokyo at 9,000 feet, and right after we released the bombs, the target was the edge of the firestorm. And I also should probably say that one of the processes that General Lemay used was to inform 12 cities in the island of Japan that they were on the target list to be hit the next night. There was a warning given to evacuate the cities. And at the briefing for the Tokyo mission, we were told, specifically instructed not to hit the palace where the Emperor of Japan was in residence. And so as we came in, we hit the edge of the firestorm. We dropped our bombs just outside the edge of the firestorm. You could see the firestorm moving through the town.
At altitude staggered between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, wave after wave of Superforts dropped their M69 incendiary cluster bombs. Each aircraft had a bomb load of 8 tons. Each M69 was set to burst at 2,000 feet altitude, which in turn divided into 38 separate submunitions covering an area 500 feet by 2,500 feet with burning napalm. The huge updrafts that occurred from the fires had a tremendous effect on the Superforts, blowing them straight up. The fire below lit up the skies so that it almost looked like daylight.
What we encountered was what looked like, but when we got into it, as we drove straight into our release point, it quickly turned out to be a fire cloud. And it was full of debris being swept up from this 17 square miles of Tokyo that was burned out that first night that we tried it.
The first incendiary attack was the turning point of the air war against Japan, destroying over 260,000 buildings and killing over 80,000 people. It was by far the highest death toll of any single day's action of the war.
Hello, Al Benzing back with you. I hope you found the video interesting. And at the end, of course, they were talking about the firebombing and great loss of life. And of course, loss of life was occurring on both ends. War is very brutal, it's devastating. And a friend of mine, Don Nass, sent some information to me that was very compelling in that he lost his best friend on one of the missions. And the article was about this crew. This article was in Collier's magazine. So Don brought it to my attention because this crew was lost and then never even found the crash site for 50 years. They crashed into Fujiyama. And so it's a description of an everyday crew going about their duties. And you can see they're fine young men that sacrificed for us. I'll also mention that Don sent me this log sheet, and it's basically of his last flight. And they were bombing Tokyo, and the plane ahead of them was rammed by a Japanese fighter and went down in flames. And while it was doing that, it was streaming fuel that they had to maneuver to avoid. Their aircraft suffered flak damage. Co-pilot's window was blown out. The rapid depressurization caused an intense fog. He said he could barely see his hand. And they thought they were on fire for a moment. You couldn't really tell if it was smoke or fog. They also had a punctured fuel tank. So instead of being able to get back to Guam, they struggled to get to Iwo Jima. So a very challenging flight that turned out to be their last combat flight, which was the 8th of August, 1945. So again, these men had tough duty, risked their lives for us, and we always keep that in mind. Thank you. As you bring up part 2 of the videos, we'll be talking about the Boeing 50th anniversary of the B-29. They put on a very nice production that's from the viewpoint of a flight engineer, and that's the man who really knows the airplane and really works hard to keep it running, and takes you through missions and so on. It's quite a good piece. And at the end, of course, we're very proud to see FIFI being refurbished by Boeing, repainted by Boeing, and flying in the video. So thank you again for your support.